Wonderful. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Wednesday. It is the comprehensivist Wednesday. And I'm delighted to have Sanjay here we're going to be talking about neuroscience and mindfulness. So we're going to do this in a Q&A format. So I'm going to ask Sanjay questions, and then I will open it up for Q&A of the audience. Then we'll go ahead and do breakout rooms, come back for the second section. So there are going to be two sections. Again, each of the sections will be followed by Q&A and breakout rooms. And finally, we'll be coming together for some final thoughts. So that's the plan. Let's get started. So Sanjay, what is meditation and what specifically is mindfulness meditation?
All right. So meditation falls under the category of what we do to regulate ourselves. It's called self-regulation. I have some slides if that'll help.
Sure.
Concepts. So let me try to pull that up. Some of the concepts may be quite detailed, so I want to make sure that people can read it as well as follow what I say. So I think, can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay. So basically meditation. So I'll describe what meditation is, and then we'll go into mindfulness meditation. And so all meditation falls under what's known as self-regulation, right? And self-regulation is something that we do, animals and humans, we all do this to basically soothe ourselves, either soothe our body or our mind. So for example, if you have a pain in your body, you want to alleviate that pain. You don't want to feel it. You want to do something to get rid of it. Or if you have an itch, same thing. Or if you have a sad feeling, you don't want to continue feeling sad. You want to basically change how you're feeling. So all of these types of behaviors fall under, the concept of self-regulation. You're regulating your own behavior. You're regulating your own mind. And these are known. They are described as part of the executive function of our brain. And this is something that we humans have. Some animals also have them, but we humans have them, and we develop it at an early age in our childhood. And it's basically where we are able to act. We're able to act actively and voluntarily. We make decisions on what we want to do. So if we're feeling bad about something, we realize it and we want to change that. We want to feel good. So we exercise our executive function. The next part of that is exactly what does meditation entail? And
Sanjay, let me just follow up on that. So self-regulation, we're kind of just stepping back. This is the first time I've heard anybody describe meditation as self-regulation. Self-regulation is a core biological concept, right? I mean, all living beings have to have some kind of self-regulatory mechanism to maintain homeostasis, to kind of come back from states which are not conducive to their life back to the conducive states. So in the realm of biology and of all the kind of self-regulatory things that are there, mechanisms that are there, where does meditation fit in?
So if you, for some of the people who may have seen or attended the previous talk that I gave, basically our brain developed evolutionarily to help us survive, help us be more functional. And so,
Sanjay, could you increase your volume or be closer to the mic?
Let me.
Yeah, this is much better.
Okay. So what we did is, so I'm not sure if my if I can change. Anyway, so what our body, as our body developed, our mind was not as capable, because when we were simple organisms, before we were vertebrate animals, our mind was not very capable. So our body basically regulated itself. But as our mind became more capable and we had to deal with more complex issues, more complex environments and situations, if we were in states of danger where we had to make a decision, not an automatic decision, but a more thoughtful decision, then our mind started developing a lot more capabilities. So self-regulation is a part of our biological being, but for more complicated animals, and we are animals, so for more complicated beings who have more complex behaviors, we also have a need to self-regulate our behaviors in our mind, because our mind can get into dysfunctional states. It can get into basically have problems. So self-regulation. So let me describe it. You know, if you think about what happened in history, in prehistory, or before we became hominids, you know, we developed these functions because if you think of an animal that's born, let's say a cat, and when it's just born, it will come into a world and it will experience a lot of things that are not comfortable. And this happens of most animals that are born live from a mother, you know, through sexual reproduction. They remain inside their mother's body at a fairly high temperature, you know, not at the ambient temperature. But when they come into the world, they come into basically a cold world. It's a very cold world. It's usually 20 degrees Fahrenheit colder. And that's an immediate shock, right? So same thing for a human being. When a human being's born, first time they're born, they experience a lot of discomfort early on. And in the modern world, in a hospital, what happens is the nurses or the caretakers will put them in a blanket, they'll put them under a heat lamp maybe, and they'll try to cool their body, warm their body back. And that's an act of regulation, right? Another person is regulating that baby's behavior and helping them to feel comfortable. Now, what happens with all of us is that over the first few weeks and possibly a few months, about 2 months, we start to learn these behaviors. Well, first we start to learn that it's possible for us to regulate our body and our mind. That's an important skill that we learn fairly early. And then after that, we start to realize that we can do it ourselves. And our brain is the organ that does that for us. So our brain is very much involved in self-regulation.
Excellent. Thanks.
So the next step, I think, let me see if I can, my screen is not moving, there it is. So the next step with so I'm first talking about meditation in general. So there are three aspects that all meditation practices encompass. The first is attention control. And this is basically, you know, as it sounds, it's controlling our attention or focusing on something. The next is emotional regulation. And this is specifically, we're trying to regulate and manage our emotions. Usually it's negative emotions, but also it can be positive emotions. You don't want to get too hyper or too, you know, excited about something in some situations. And similarly, you don't want negative emotions to do that also. And thirdly, self-awareness. And this is kind of related to consciousness, but it's broader than that. It's basically being aware of where we are, what we're doing, the environment around us. Oftentimes, you know, when we're doing, as we get older and we're doing more complicated things, for example, if you're driving, right? Even when we're driving and we're looking straight ahead out of the windshield of the car, in the back of our mind, we have this awareness of where other cars are around us. We have an awareness of who else may be in our vehicle with us, right? We have an awareness of the conversation that we may be having, or if we're listening to a podcast or a radio or something, these things we have awareness of, even though our mind or eye, our senses are not focused, you know, 24, you know, completely on every one of those activities. We have an awareness about ourselves. And the awareness is, just as we have awareness of the things around us, we also have awareness of things inside of us, inside of our mind. So self-awareness is basically that. So these three areas all are areas that meditation tries to enhance, these three specific areas. So next, what I'll do is I'll describe all of meditation in terms of two categories. Okay, there's primarily two categories that, you know, researchers have created this definition. They found by talking to a lot of long-term practitioners, people who practice meditation, you know, for dozens of years, sometimes 30, 40 years, you know, in a lot of Eastern cultures. They've interviewed and studied them, and they've talked to them at length, and they've understood that. Hold on, I think my screen seems to be jumping. Sorry about that. So after talking to many people, and also after assessing the types of activities that even new meditators perform, they came up with two categories that can be used to classify all types of meditations. And the first is called focused attention. And this primarily deals with focusing on something specific. It can be focusing on your breath. It can be focusing on an idea or a mantra, right? It can be focusing on a body part. It can be focusing on a pose or a thought. But it's basically, focus is the key concept there, that while you're meditating, you're focusing in a very specific way. And you're trying to keep your focus on that area, that object or that thought, throughout your meditation session. So that's one type. The second type of meditation is called open monitoring. And this is where you're monitoring the present situation, the moment that you happen to be in. And you're open to whatever happens. You're open to whatever happens inside your mind, and you're open to whatever happens outside of you. Now, some of you who may have looked into meditation, who are familiar with it, realize that there are many, many types of meditations. More than 30 broad categories, and even those can be split up based on the schools and traditions and the nuances between them. Basically the masters or maybe the teacher that you learn from. So there's a lot of variety in meditation, and the variety really comes between. The variety comes because each person, each of us, are not able to necessarily do each of these things well. Some of us are better at focusing. Others are better at not focusing, but being open to experiences. And so a lot of the meditation techniques primarily focus, they rely on one or the other, but some of them do use aspects of both of these. So in general, we can classify all meditation as falling into either focused attention or open monitoring, or a combination of the two. And here I've listed a few examples of common meditation techniques that people may be aware of. Vipassana is one that actually falls under both of these. It's mostly focused attention, but it also has aspects of open monitoring. Mindfulness is what we're talking about today, and mindfulness falls under the open monitoring area. So mindfulness is primarily about being in the now. It's about focusing on what's happening to us, and not allowing our thoughts to deviate to the past or to the future. Hopefully this we'll have Q&A after this. So if anybody does have questions, we can go into those later. So specific to mindfulness meditation, mindfulness meditation is talking about the moment-to-moment monitoring. Okay, again, we're talking about observing, seeing in either in ourselves or outside of ourselves. And again, as I said, that people are good at doing some aspects and sometimes not good at doing other aspects. So because some of these things may be difficult for us to do, and oftentimes we all have psychological limitations, or we have stressors, or we have difficulties in doing certain things. So based on that, the meditation practices have allowed people to practice them in various ways. It's not very rigid because of that. So for example, when we talk about moment-to-moment monitoring, it may be easier for you to only monitor what's happening inside your mind, or only monitor what's happening inside your mind and your body. Or you may be able to monitor everything that's happening inside of you, as well as what's happening outside of you, right? Or someone else may be able to monitor, may not be as good monitoring what's happening inside them, but it may be easier for them to observe, the quiet world that they're sitting in when they're meditating, outside of them. So, when I say that you're monitoring the situation moment to moment, you get to decide whether you're monitoring only yourself, and even that, only your mind or your body, or both, or if you're monitoring the things outside of you. But the key aspect is that you should be focused on just the moment, the absolute instant, a second or two, not more than that, of what's happened. And important here is that you have to be open to seeing whatever happens inside your mind or body. Now, one of the things that we'll get into in subsequent slides, and we'll get into more questions, is that most of the time when people begin meditating, and actually even expert meditators, their mind always wanders. This is something that's normal, and this happens to everyone. So this is why it's important to be open to see whatever happens, because our minds will wander, our minds will get distracted. We may ruminate about thoughts or things that happened, negative or positive. and this is normal. So be open to it. Don't stress about it, and don't try to stop it. Don't try to block those thoughts from coming or diversions from coming. So the first aspect is moment-to-moment monitoring. The second is non-judgmental, and this is based on John Kabat-Zinn. He's one of the researchers who's done a lot of research on mindfulness meditation. He also created a fairly good practice program. It's free online, and in the 52 Living Ideas group, we had actually gone through that program a few months ago. And it's a fairly good program. So in that, he talks about not being non-judgmental. He created a definition for mindfulness meditation, which was moment-to-moment non-judgmental self-awareness. So that's where the moment-to-moment monitoring refers to the moment-to-moment and self-awareness, and non-judgmental is the third part of that. And so non-judgmental. A lot of times when people hear this, they think it means something else. They think that, you're not supposed to be judgmental at yourself. And remember that, when you're meditating, your mind will wander. It will do things that it wants to do. And you may get upset. You may think that, oh, why can't I control myself? Why is my mind doing this? Why am I not better at this? And those are judgmental thoughts. So it's important to know that there's no reason to be judgmental. If your mind does something that you don't like, that's okay. No problem with that. So the key aspect here is that judgments will happen, that when something happens during our meditation, we will have emotions come into us that will be judgmental. And so don't force yourself to be non-judgmental. Don't worry about it. If you can, what you should do is try to suspend any judgment that you have until after you're finished meditating. That's the better approach. It may not be possible to stop all judgmental behaviors. And the third bullet I put here is really to help us kind of see what one of the long-term, some of the long-term benefits of meditation. People who practice for a few months, and what I mean by practice is you have to practice in a specific way, and we'll get into that subsequently. But if you're able to practice in a specific way, then you will see that this wandering aspect of our mind will lessen over time. It'll get less and less. It will never go away. But you'll be able, or your mind basically will manage it on its own. This is a skill that it will learn on its own. And what that means is that there's a related aspect of that, is that your conscious ability to not react, to not judge, or to not give up on whatever you're doing, that will increase. Your ability to do these things will increase, which means that in the beginning, people who start may notice that they see something happen in their mind, that they have a thought, and they're not happy about it. They think that it's interfering with their meditation, and they immediately react, within a second. So if you're meditating for some time, after you get experience, what will happen is that reaction that you have to your mind wandering, it may take you 2 or 3 seconds for you to react. It'll be delayed. And if you continue meditating, if you continue practicing appropriately, you may find that after a while, you may be able to hold off on your reaction for maybe 3 or 4 or 5 seconds. And eventually, if you get really good at it, you may be able to hold off and completely stop these reactive behaviors. So what the ideal aspect of this is that these are things you'll notice when you're meditating, but these same behaviors may actually help you in your daily life when you're not meditating. Because what you're doing by meditation is you're training your brain to behave in certain ways, specifically not to react to events that you're not comfortable with. This is, again, that aspect of self-regulation. You're teaching your mind to self-regulate itself. So there are 2 parts of that. One is it's avoiding the negative feelings that arise when something wrong happens. And secondly, when something wrong does happen, it kind of brings you back into a centered, comfortable situation that you're not judging and you're not negative about it. So these are overall mindfulness meditation. I'll stop here. I think.
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Yeah.
So first question, you talked about the mind wandering. Why does the mind wander?
Okay. that's something that I will go into in a few minutes. I'll hold off on it, but basically
Sure.
what I'll say is that it's very normal for our mind to wander. Okay, there's nothing wrong with it. It's actually a healthy aspect of our mind. Um, our mind wanders because it's trying to figure things out. Okay, and in a sense, you can think of it as mind wandering is a situation where your mind is trying to put forth in your consciousness, in your conscious mind, it's trying to put forth things that it needs dealt with. Okay, so again, when we talk about self-regulation, this is one of the ways that our mind brings forth the things that are troubling it. So if people who understand the subconscious part of our mind or that view of psychology, they'll understand that most of our behavior occurs and exists in our subconscious. So this mind wandering is a way that our mind uses to bring something out of our subconscious that at that moment happens to be either troubling or it happens to be something that it wants dealt with, and it brings it into our consciousness. And the hope is that your conscious mind will do something about it. But most of the time, what we've learned, a negative behavior that we've learned, is we've learned to push it back into our subconscious. We don't deal with it immediately. We kind of push it away. And that's the reason why these thoughts keep coming back, because we keep pushing them away.
Excellent. Where would you like to go next, Sanjay?
Let's continue with the questions. So I'm not sure if I switch. Can you see? I don't know what part of my screen is being shared. I have
currently you have the slide showing what is mindfulness meditation.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
So if you want to do just questions, we can stop sharing. And
yeah, let me do that.
Okay, so we'll take questions from the audience now. Okay, give me just a second. So folks, we have the following rules, 4 rules. In order to ask question, go ahead and type ! in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. We're talking only about mindfulness and neuroscience. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, speak your mind and do so courteously. All right, so those are the questions. So those are the rules. We're going to start with Jairo. Jairo, go ahead. Jairo, can you go ahead and try unmuting yourself again?
Okay. So what do you mean by not react? What's a reaction that you're doing less or it takes a longer time to do?
Yeah, so very good question, very important question. And so anybody who begins meditating will find that when you're meditating, and actually in a few minutes after the Q&A, I'm going to go into a very simple technique. I'll give people an example of a very simple technique that follows the mindfulness metaphor. And it will help. It should be practicable by most people. It's simple enough. So when we begin meditating, our mind, certain thoughts come into our mind. Okay, that's a given. Thoughts or emotions. So what tends to happen with most people is that they feel like, or they've been told that meditation is about being calm, or meditation is about being still and not letting distractions arise, or meditation is about focusing on something, and if a thought comes in, then you're no longer focusing. And so they learn that meditation shouldn't, when you're meditating, these things should not be happening, that you should not have thoughts or emotions arise in your mind. That's actually not correct, because it's okay to let those thoughts come. Although what will happen is, over time, if you follow meditation correctly, if you follow it in an appropriate way, over time, those thoughts and emotions will become less. They will automatically but they will automatically reduce coming. And that's an important element here. So when people initially start meditating and these thoughts or emotions come, they think about, they kind of act in a judgmental way and say to themselves, I shouldn't have let that happen, or why is that happening, or am I not doing this correctly, right? They start questioning themselves whether they're doing this correctly, or whether they can ever do meditation in a correct way. And that's what reacting means. Reacting means that you're having additional thoughts. You stop doing the base meditation aspect, and you started to think about your meta behavior around meditation. That's what reacting is.
Okay, next question is from Lynn. Lynn, go ahead. Lynn, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry. This may be just semantics, but I have a hard time connecting between focusing and being open. So it seems like a contradiction to me.
So let me give an example. When I started meditating first, I learned a technique which I found fairly useful, and that was the open meditation style, the open monitoring style. And what I learned to do was to basically sit quietly in a room, usually with your eyes closed, because you don't want diversions or other things to distract you, and just sit quietly and don't think about anything. Just try to just sit there. And what will happen, and when you're sitting there, what will happen is that thoughts will come into your mind, thoughts or emotions. And what I was told was, when you notice a thought or emotion come in, think of them coming in as if they're in a river. Think of yourself sitting on the side of a river, and these thoughts come into your mind as if they're floating on a river. Okay, and so the right thing to do is to let those thoughts continue on the river, and what you'll find is that they'll continue flowing on the river and they'll flow away. You'll no longer be thinking about them. Okay, and so that's an example where you're open to whatever happens. For example, if you're sitting quietly and a thought comes into your mind, you're open to that. You're saying it's okay, and that thought sometimes it's distressing thoughts. Sometimes it might be something you have to do later in the day, or something that you did, a few days ago, and you're remembering, oh, I forgot, or, it's a thought that's kind of distracting you, right? So it's okay to have that thought. But the key aspect is not to grab onto that thought and start thinking about it more, okay? Just acknowledge that you had the thought, understand that it's there, and just imagine it sitting on a leaf floating in this river, and it floats away. And maybe in the beginning, it might take a minute or two for it to float away, because your mind keeps jumping back at the thought and thinking about it, and then you realize and you stop thinking about it. So that's an example of open-minded, open monitoring, where you're just monitoring this river, and the river represents your thoughts, okay? And you're not reacting to whatever comes down the river or where it goes, or if it lingers too long or anything like that. Focused attention is about your before you begin meditating, you think about something that you're going to focus on. And this aspect actually depends on the type of meditation that you're using, because some meditate, like transcendental meditation, have specific rules around what you focus on. Vipassana, each type of meditation, which uses the focused attention metaphor, you're taught to focus in a specific way. It might be focusing on a mantra. It might be focusing on a sound. It might be focusing on a part of your body, your breath, for example. And so that's the aspect of focusing.
Thank you, Sanjay. So next up is Mamta, Joe, and Vanessa. Mamta, what is your question?
So I will be very quick, though I have around 5-6 questions. So I'm asking only one. Don't worry.
Go ahead.
How important is the value of posture, say lotus posture, in active meditation? Because I have been dealing with, doing other meditation techniques, lots of, and walking is my meditation primary, but then Kundalini Yoga and Vipassana and other. But I am unable to sit in lotus posture since my childhood. But I do get the benefit. So I gave up trying to sit in lotus posture because my calf are too big. And I want to do that, but that's my question. Okay,
thank you. Sanjay.
Yeah, so meditation doesn't require any specific posture or any specific behavior, any specific position or room, or you can even meditate with your eyes open or eyes closed. You can meditate. Meditation is really, again, if you understand that it's about self-regulating, that it's about soothing yourself, then you realize that if you're sitting in a position that's painful, that's kind of the opposite of what you should be doing, right? We should not be sitting in difficult situations. And meditation is something we're doing for ourselves. So if it doesn't feel comfortable to you, it's something that, maybe, should not be part of your meditation practice.
Thanks, Sanjay. Next up is Joe. Joe?
Hi, Sanjay. This is a little bit maybe outside the topic, but I just wanted to throw it out there because I think you probably would likely know this, is the part of the brains that are associated with, or what are the different parts of the brains that are associated with emotions and judgments? And maybe what is the links between those two, like while we're meditating?
So, yeah, I mean, we'll
Or are you going to get to that?
Well, so hopefully we can get into some of this later a bit. I mean, this will get into a lot of detail, but I don't want to go into too much detail because people can get lost quickly. But basically, emotions, there's no one area of our brain that handles emotions. Emotions handle, they primarily, strong emotions primarily start in our limbic system, but they can end up anywhere. And so if you think about what, in the last talk that we had, I tried to describe brain states, and I tried to describe how thoughts and emotions move throughout our brain. So if emotions start in the limbic system, in the various parts, what will happen is over time, over a few seconds, they will move to other parts of the brain. And they'll move based on aspects of that emotion. They'll move because our mind has this self-regulatory goal. It's always trying to regulate itself. One of the things that our prefrontal cortex does is it's kind of on the lookout for problems that are happening in our brain, like excessive stress or strong reactions to things. So, for example, if you're sitting and let's say you get bitten by an ant and you're sitting somewhere, right, in a park bench. Well, when you're bitten by that ant, a part of your brain will have a strong reaction. Okay. And that strong reaction will first start in your brainstem, because that's where the sensation will start, and it'll eventually go to your limbic system where it'll create fear. And then your prefrontal cortex will become aware that there are these two strong emotional type of states in your brain. And it'll try to kind of query, it'll try to figure out what's happening. And once it figures it out, it'll try to alleviate that. So then, once you became conscious of that feeling of an ant pinching you, of an insect pinching you, your brain will make your neck and your eyes turn to look where the pain is and see what's happening there. Is it an ant, or maybe is it a piece of glass that you stepped on, or what is it? What exactly is causing the pain? Right? Your mind will make your body move and look at the area of pain, and etc. So emotions are not limited to just a few areas. They can really go in almost any part of our brain. And how they're resolved depends on the specific situations. This is one of the challenges in studies in the neurosciences, is that it is so difficult to know exactly where things originate and where they end up. And the tools that we have today, even though we do have sophisticated tools, they're still not sophisticated enough to give us real-time, very precise, detailed information about this. So this is something that there's still a lot of studies that need to be done in this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjay. Vanessa, what's your question?
Okay, I was wondering if you know some simple yoga poses, like to get the focusing on one like body part, like doing like a downward dog or child's pose, like for like 5 minutes. Like if you're doing aerobics, you don't just like rush into it. You maybe like do jumping jacks for 2 minutes or something. Can that help kind of get the focus and the blood flowing? And
so yoga and the poses that you use during meditation is, again, the goal should be to keep your body not in an excited state, right? You don't want your body, for example, if you're in a downward dog, if you're in a complicated yoga pose, then probably you're trying to balance your body. You're trying to, your respiration may be elevated. If you're upside down, your blood flow, your blood pressure may also be elevated. And these are things that are probably counterproductive to meditation. So you want to be in as relaxed a pose as you can be for meditation.
Thanks. Next up is Ed, followed by Gretchen. Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, hi Sanjay. How important is breathing and developing a certain pattern of breathing before and during the meditation process?
Yeah, so I mean, you want to breathe normally so that you're getting enough oxygen. You want to, I mean, first, I guess overall, there's no right or wrong. That's the first thing I want to say about meditation, is that there's nothing right or wrong. If you want to find the best way to meditate, we should look at what's the best way to make ourselves comfortable. Okay, that's basically the goal of meditation, is to start in a comfortable situation. And that includes the location that you're in, the room, the environment that you're in. Should not be too noisy, should not be too hot or cold. The position that you're sitting in should be comfortable, and it should be comfortable for as long as you plan to meditate. If it's 20 minutes or an hour or 2 minutes, you should be able to stay comfortable for that duration. Breathing, and so some types of meditation involve controlled breathing. That's an aspect of the focused types of meditation. Some of them do involve breathing. So that's where you will need to do the breathing as the meditation modality suggests you do. But in most other types of meditation, breathing is there's no special need for breathing. It just has to be a comfortable breathing. You should just have normal breaths. You should not be breathing too quickly or too slowly. There is actually, I'm going to go into some studies later on, and one of the studies looked at, it was an actual side effect, not a side effect, it was a finding of where the control groups around breathing that I'll go into later on. But if you can remind me, or I'll try to remember that.
I'll do that. Next up is Gretchen, and then we're going to continue with an exercise in a demonstration of mindfulness. Gretchen, go ahead.
Hey, Sanjay. Hi. Thank you so much. It's really interesting to me to find that meditation is a function of the executive level functioning, which I never knew of. Now, I'm disabled because I'm severely impaired in my executive level functioning. So what I found is all the stuff that you were talking about in mindfulness are all things that I have trouble with. Now, it's my understanding too that people who have like dementia, dementia are starting to have the cognitive decline. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's also affects the executive level functioning. So my question is, given that that's what controls kind of the mindfulness, is it by practicing mindfulness, can that have an effect on your executive level functioning, both from, a perspective of me, but, more globally, probably people with, that are experiencing dementia and stuff like that, can that help them with those problems?
Yeah, very good question. So the quick answer is we don't know, but more than likely, so executive functions have many, many aspects to them. People who go through types of dementia, neurological decline, that happens for many different reasons. And usually those reasons have to do with a decline in the physiological functioning of the brain, either specific neurotransmitters, or they're having amyloid plaques that build up in the brain, which cause problems in nerve functioning, in signal transmission. So there are many different reasons why somebody with dementia, one of the dementias, can have problems. But I would imagine you don't, and most people who don't have this, those types of declines, some difficulty with executive function. But first, let me clarify this, that when I said that mindfulness and self-regulation is a part of our executive function, this doesn't mean that it is only a part of our executive function. Our executive functions are primarily governing multiple things, multiple processes that are happening. So a lot of what happens in our brain is not just one thing happening at one time. In the last talk, I described a simple analogy of a conductor. And in our brain, it's actually that a lot of times, there's no one single conductor. I mean, oftentimes there's no one single conductor. But if there is ever, in some rare cases there are, so in those times that there is a conductor, it's usually the executive part of our brain which is acting in that way. But even then, it's not acting alone. It's kind of working with a few other regions in the neocortex together. So even if anybody has difficulty with this, they will, through practice, they will get better. They'll get better. Yeah, I mean that's what seems to be the case. Although I'm not aware of any studies that have looked into this specifically. The type of situation you're describing.
Let's take one more question. I think Jyoti, you had a question.
Yeah, Sanjay, firstly, it's a great presentation. My question is more or less like Rachel's. People who have attention deficit disorder, and how can they regulate? Because if meditation is all about self-regulation, and they don't have that self-regulation, how can they meditate? What is the best technique for them to meditate so that they can start focusing? Because I hear in the school system that the parents don't want to put their children on rhythm, and they want them to learn naturally, and then this meditation doesn't fly that much with them. Do you have an answer for that?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why in this talk, I decided to focus on mindfulness meditation is because I believe that mindfulness meditation, or open meditation in general, is a little easier for most people than focus attention. So when you're talking about paying attention, focusing, that's actually difficult for a lot of people, especially for children with ADHD or difficulty focusing. So that's one of the reasons why, because I suspect a lot of people don't understand this difference in meditation. They assume that all meditation involves focusing, and that's not the case. Mindfulness actually is not about focusing. It's about just being comfortable, with accepting what happens, which is a very different type of behavior. And in a few minutes, I will go into an example, which will help. Hopefully, it'll help everyone to understand why mindfulness, I believe, is easier to practice.
Excellent. So let's get to the next thing, because I want to make sure that you have enough time to cover all the ground that you would like to cover. Go ahead, Sanjay.
Okay. Yeah, there's today's again going to be a full session. So let me go back into. So actually, I think the next point we wanted to go into. Let me pull up I'm just going through my notes quickly. So the next thing we want to look at is we'll look at a fairly simple and effective method for mindfulness meditation. Okay. And let me, if I could, I'll put up a screen so that this will help. Let's see. Okay, so this slide describes a fairly simple technique. It's a 4-step process. And actually, if you think about it, it's really 3 steps, because the 4th step is just go back to step 1. So first, remember that this is dealing with what's known as open monitoring. Okay, what the goal is you're openly just monitoring, you're observing whatever's happening. So the first step at the top of this 4 ovals is to just focus and observe about what's happening now, right? What's happening, and for some people it may be difficult to focus on outside and inside. So if it's difficult, then just focus on what's happening in either your body or your mind, one or the other. Try to keep it as simple as possible at the beginning. So just focus on what's happening, and as you focus, time will pass, and your mind automatically will shift to number 2, which means that your mind has begun to wander. That's automatic. Okay, this is automatic. This is normal, and it's perfectly okay. This is what's important for people to understand: is it's okay. This is expected. Okay, what if you practice meditation sufficiently, long enough, this transition from 1 to 2 will happen less frequently, and will gain the ability to control it. Okay, that's the advantage. This transition from 1 to 2 is actually the most important part of meditation. The ability to slow this down and long-term to stop this from happening. And I'll go into later why we want to stop it from happening. But in the beginning, you don't want to stop it from happening. So if you start to observe the situation where what's happening in the moment with you, and you won't even realize it, but your mind will start thinking about something. And this is automatic. So once you realize it, then we're into number 3. when you're wandering, you won't realize it. It may be a few seconds, it may be a few minutes that you go off into a tangent. You start thinking about something you have to do next day, right? And you're so engrossed in it. And after a while, you'll realize, oh, I stopped thinking about, I stopped meditating. And then you're in step 3. So once you realize that your mind is wandered, okay, be sure not to be judgmental. Okay? Suspend all judgments about what happened. It's okay. There's not a problem with that, right? So once you realize it, then you go to step 4 and you shift your focus back to step 1. Shift yourself gently back to observing the situation, observing the now. So this is a simple cycle that I believe anybody should be able to practice. And in the beginning, it definitely will be difficult because probably your mind will wander every 10 seconds or every 15 seconds. This is normal. Okay? But just patiently, gently bring yourself back into focus whenever that happens. And for those of you for whom visualization helps, I mean, that actually helped for me in the beginning when I started. The example that I gave of imagining yourself sitting next to a river, right? A very quiet, peaceful river. And any time that your mind wanders, that's basically, think of it as a thought or emotion or something floating on a leaf. It might be a lily pad, it might be a large leaf, it might be a small leaf, but it comes on a leaf floating down this river, and it's going to kind of take over your mind. It's going to make your mind wander. So once you realize that that happened, let the leaf continue flowing down that river. Okay? And just bring your focus back into thinking about the now. Right? So this is, I believe, something simple enough, and it doesn't really require too many complicated things. I mean, I think it's simple enough that most people should be able to practice it. Now, I have a asterisk, a point here, that when you're focusing on and observing the present moment, some people might have difficulty doing that. And again, this is why meditation is flexible. That probably means that, but I suspect that not too many people will have difficulty in this, but there may be some. So if that's what happens, then try to focus on something like your breath or something like your nostrils, the air going in and out of your nostrils. That might help you to keep being aware of the present. Now, the problem here is that that's no longer using simply the open monitoring technique. You're starting to combine the focus and the OM technique, but that's okay, right? If that works for you, still try to use the OM part of this if you can, but use focusing on your breath or your nostrils, something like that, to help you stay aware in the present. Okay, so I think if we want to, let me stop sharing. This is a point I think we can maybe do breakouts. Is that? I can't hear you, Shika.
Sorry about that. So can you talk about that? That's a good idea. Let's take one question that Kate had. Kate, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what you think of the guided meditations where it's like you're in a forest.
Kate, let's hold off for that. Maybe let's hold off for that. Let's just focus on this mindfulness meditation for now. And you can ask the same question again at a later Q&A. So let's focus on these breakout rooms now. What do you want people to do in the breakout rooms, Sanjay?
Okay, so I have 2 questions that I think will help to guide the discussion. Let me just do a screen share, and I will try to post those in the.
Yeah, the best thing is to just copy and paste it into chat, so people can actually take it with them if they want.
Yeah. Okay, so I posted 2 questions for everyone to think about. And these 2 questions have to do with sleeping and dreaming. Okay, so first, what does sleep do for our mind? And the second question is, what do you believe dreaming does for our mind? Overall, does it help us or does it have a neutral effect, or is it harmful? So these are fairly simple questions, but it may raise some discussion, which we'll get into after the breakout.
Okay, sounds good. Let me go ahead and, okay, all the breakout rooms are ready. So we're going to do breakout rooms for about 20 minutes. Is that 20 minutes too much, or should we make it 15?
15 way better, but if you think 20 is fine, I'm fine.
No, I think let's do 15 because I want to make sure that we have enough time to go through everything else we want to go through. All right, folks, so I'm starting the breakout rooms now. In the breakout rooms, start by letting everybody speak what they want to speak for 1 to 2 minutes. So everybody is able to put their thoughts on the table, and we'll take it from there. All right, and see you back. You'll automatically come back here in the main room in 15 minutes.
Okay, so one of the things that I want to go into next is mind wandering. Okay? And this is something that we got into a little bit earlier. We talked about it. And hopefully people were able to look at the one of the resources that I posted on the Meetup page. And it's basically a one-page, actually it's a research paper. It's a formal research paper. It's probably one of the shortest that most of you will read. It's a single page. It's a real paper. It's a serious paper. It was published, and it's actually fairly well done. It's been cited hundreds of times, so it's a fairly good paper. But it's very simple. And so if anyone has not read it, I'll just do a quick description of it. Unfortunately, on the computer that I'm on right now, I don't have a copy of that paper, so I'll talk about it off of memory. But basically what the researchers did was they wanted to look at mind wandering, and specifically in the context of meditation. And they wanted to see if it was something that, how it affected people. And what they did is they created an app for smartphones, and they allowed people to download it for free, anybody. And I think, millions of people, several 100,000 people downloaded it initially, and they started getting data. They started collecting data. And what the app would do was it would ask them, when you load the app, you would configure the app to kind of prompt you, to remind you at various times throughout the day to ask you certain questions. And so the app, once it's set up, you'd go about your life, and your phone would kind of remind you at certain times of the day. It would ask you questions. And the questions typically were around what you were doing, and they were focused on whether you were doing something that was active, or whether you were doing something passive, whether you were doing something that was caused negative emotions or negative reactions, or positive or neutral. And they looked at, the app developer, the researchers, they categorized all of this information. They put it into huge databases, and so this paper presents the findings from this long-term study of millions of data points from hundreds of thousands of people. And what they found was that, unfortunately, actually I can pull it up on another computer I have next to me, but what it actually found was that and they were looking at moments when their attention got distracted, which is what mind wandering is about. Mind wandering is when you're engaged in an activity and you lose track of it and either another thought comes in, or you start to daydream or ruminate. And they looked at these aspects, and what they found was that the most likely most people, when they were when their mind was wandering. Actually, I have to pull this up because I don't remember the details. My memory's not as good as it should be. Sorry about that. So I'll keep talking while I'm looking on my other computer. So what they did is they looked at all of the different types of behaviors that people were engaged in, and they, again, from memory, it was around 50 different types of activities, behaviors that they classified people in, and they found that. Sorry about that. I want to make sure I present this correctly because this is it's important in what they found. You know what, let me do this. Okay. Yeah. So if you look, so anybody who has seen the paper or they might have it in front of them, in the middle of the paper, there's actually a graph which tabulates the findings from the study. And it's a little bit, the graph format that they chose is a little unusual. It's actually two graphs in one that are kind of related. So if you see there's a horizontal line at the lower part, just above where it says unpleasant mind wandering. And what they did is they tabulated above that, they tabulated all the different types of activities that the people were involved in. And the bottom portion is the part that tabulates whether the mind wandering event they perceived as being unpleasant or they perceived as being neutral or pleasant, or whether they were not engaged in any mind wandering. And then if you look very closely, there's a vertical line that runs throughout the whole graph from top to bottom. It's kind of in the middle. And that's the average situation that they found most people were engaged in. And what this graph basically says is that most people who had an unpleasant experience from mind wandering had a very unpleasant experience. It was significantly worse than the median line, the vertical line. And most people who were not engaged in mind wandering, it did not have too much of an impact on them. They were, although more people of all the four orbs, the four circles at the bottom, largest circle is people who did not engage in any mind wandering when the phone app prompted them. So basically, they were busy doing something important to them. Although small number of who did find it unpleasant that they were ruminating about or their mind was wandering about, it was a significant discomfort for them. So basically what this study tells us is that mind wandering has a fairly, it affects it does not affect most people, but for the people that it does affect, it has a fairly substantial impact on them in terms of their mood and emotion. And there's actually a second part of this that most people who had experience of mind wandering, they were not able to control it. It happened independent of what they were doing prior to that, when the app asked them. So, basically what the study is saying is that mind wandering is something that happens in all of us. And for most people where it happens, when they experience mind wandering, it's a negative experience. Although the percentage in this study, the percentage of people that it affected negatively was less. The majority of people did not have mind wandering when they were asked. So it's a fairly negative behavior that happens to all of us. And it's something that we cannot stop. It's something that's fairly automatic. So because of that, and when we're meditating, the same thing happens. That it's probably more likely to happen when we're meditating because we're not focusing on some specific task. In the study that I talked about, in that study, people were interrupted in the middle of the day, and they could have been doing anything. If they're doing something important, then chances are that their mind would not have been wandering because they were focused on a specific activity. But when you're meditating, you're not focused on a specific activity. So it's actually easier for your mind to wander. And it is uncomfortable for most people because it's not something you want to do, or you don't want that to affect you because you're engaged in meditating. You're engaged in trying to calm, observe things and just be at peace with whatever's happening. So because mind wandering is so difficult, meditation is a tool that there are many studies that have actually tried to look into it, but look into how do we help people with not being distracted through when they're meditating, not to be distracted. And this is actually a pretty difficult aspect of research. I'm not going to be able to go into this too much because it is difficult I wasn't able to find a lot of studies that could give concrete findings for this. But in general, it's something that most meditators find problematic. What I want to talk about though is that why does our mind wander, right? What happens in our brain when our mind is wandering? Because everybody experiences it, and something as simple as daydreaming is actually an example of mind wandering. That happens to many people at different times. So first, a wandering mind or rumination, thoughts coming into your mind, they can express themselves either as when you start to think of something from the past, and it can be years ago, decades ago, or a day ago. It can be something that you are thinking about doing in the future. It can also be, as I said, daydreaming. And there's actually another type of mind wandering, which a lot of people don't think of as mind wandering, but it actually is in one sense. That's that when we're meditating, we also have this feeling that we're not making progress, that we're failing, or that we're not doing it correctly, or that it's too hard to do and we'll never be successful at it, right? These are all thoughts that come into our mind, or emotions. They're feelings that come into our mind, which are dissuading us. They're negative emotions that tell us basically to stop doing what we're doing. And in a sense, you can say that these are actually defensive mechanisms that our mind is putting forth to make us stop doing what we're doing. If you have a feeling that you're not successful or you're wasting your time, right? The chances are that it's going to make you stop doing what you're doing. It's going to stop you from meditating. And oftentimes what happens is when you're meditating, as thoughts arise, they start to come out of our subconscious, and they start to enter into our conscious mind. And that's what these ruminating thoughts are. However, if some of those thoughts are very troubling, if they're painful thoughts, your mind will try to get you to stop doing what you're doing. It'll try to stop you from meditating. And that's an example where you have these ideas come in where you're feeling like you're unsuccessful, you're not doing it correctly, or you're not able to figure it out. So this is an example where another aspect of rumination, of wandering thoughts coming in, but these are specific cases where it's actually dissuading you from continuing. So you have to recognize that that's actually the same thing. It's actually another form of wandering mind. So if you have the feeling when you're meditating that you should stop, actually you should not stop, because chances are that your mind is trying to prevent you from going further because there are thoughts that are trying to come out. Now, you may stop for a little while. You may pause, depending on what the thoughts are, because you know yourself. If you're starting to feel very anxious or nervous or very troubled or worried, maybe some very painful thoughts are starting to emerge. So in that case, maybe you should stop. But most people won't have that. Most people, they'll feel, their body will feel, you're sitting in a pose and you'll start to feel pain from that, and that will be a reason for you to stop. But if those are the types of reasons, then I would suggest that you try to push yourself a little bit, stay another few minutes, 2 or 3 or 5 minutes if you can, and push forward through it. And then the next time you go to meditate, see if you can do it for longer. Because practicing meditation is the most important aspect here. And also, the most important part of practicing is where you're making sure that you are not giving up, that you're not letting these distracting thoughts from stopping you, right? And the distracting thought can be something unrelated to meditation, but it can also be something related to meditation. Any type of thought can stop you. So what I want to do is go into, we talked about in the breakout rooms, we talked about sleeping and dreaming. And I want to go into a little bit of that because I'm going to tie this into wandering mind. So, the question was, why do we sleep, right? Why is it important for us to sleep? And most people, I'm sure, have figured out that sleeping is an important part of rest, right? It's a way for our body to rest, but it's also a way for our mind to rest, okay? It's very important for us because if we don't sleep, if we don't give our body rest, we will be in physiological states that don't keep us at our top functioning form. Oftentimes, physiologically, when we're doing things, we're actually damaging parts of our body very slightly, but our muscles, we may have slight tears, we may have skins that gets abraded and things like that. So during rest, your body gets a chance also to repair itself. There are cellular processes of repair, especially in the muscles and tissues that are happening. You also will get a chance to reoxygenate yourself because your breathing pattern will change during sleep, and you'll be in a restive state. So resting physiologically is important. There's also a mental component to sleep. And again, there's a resting part of it where you're letting your brain kind of rest without any direct involvement. You're not actively thinking about what you want to do. Your mind is just kind of randomly doing what it wants to do. In the breakout room that I was in, we started talking about this a little bit. So when you're sleeping, your mind is trying to, you can say, recharge, okay? But there are actually more specific things that your mind is doing when you're sleeping. And I will characterize this as mental hygiene, okay? Physical hygiene people know about, but mental hygiene, I suspect a lot of people haven't really thought of in depth. But sleeping is a form of mental hygiene. It's where your mind gets a chance to kind of reprocess emotions and feelings that it experienced recently, usually in the last day, a few hours ago. And it gets to decide which of those are important and which of those are not important. And your mind basically tries to store, it tries to assimilate, it tries to absorb and build memories off of some of those experiences that you had recently. And other experiences that were negative or that you feel are not good for you, it will try to kind of dispel them, kind of expel them. So this is a very important part of sleeping also, is that your mind is processing through the different events that have happened. And it may not be necessarily past, it could even be things that you're anticipating, right? Because sometimes dreams are about the next day or the future. So it may be things that your mind is concerned about that it's been dealing with. And it's trying to kind of figure out, and it's not active. When I say figure out, it's not that it's actively doing this, it's randomly doing this. It's kind of, these thoughts appear in our mind when we're sleeping, when we're dreaming. And I'm going to go into dreaming a little bit. And these thoughts and feelings are processed, they're assessed whether they're helpful or not. And the ones that are helpful and the ones that keep appearing, they get absorbed and they get turned into memories. So sleeping is an important part of for our mind to kind of process through all the clutter that happens during the day, and to build memories and remove memories and remove emotions and thoughts that are not helpful to us. Now, there's another example. There's an analogy that I'm going to use here. Okay, and some of you may not like the analogy. But I'm going to use it anyway, and I understand why you may not. But basically, the analogy is with urination, okay? And nobody likes to think of urination because it's, in one sense, it's negative. But if you think of it in a different way, and there is a psychological reason why most people don't want to think of urination, because it has to do with, negative. It has to do with things that we find disgusting. And in the past talk, I described, how disgust is one of those primal fears that we all have. So thinking about urination probably may drive one of the primal fears that we have. So I'm going to try to explain it in a different way. Our kidney is primarily the organ that does most of the filtering of toxins in our body, mainly through our bloodstream. And what our kidney does is after all of the toxins and the pathogens and different molecules that it collects, it passes them through to our bladder, and our bladder is basically a sac where urine gets stored. Okay, and urine is very important, and this process of renal, suspension of toxins is very important for our body, because as we go through life, as we eat and breathe, many types of negative things come into our body. And it's very important for our body to throw out, to expel the things that it doesn't want. Okay? Now, the reason why I talked about sleeping and dreaming is because sleeping and dreaming have aspects of the same thing for our mind. These are ways that our mind kind of does the same thing that our kidney and our bladder does. Okay? Our mind tries to assimilate and collect a lot of the memories that we experience throughout the day. And these memories sit in our mind for a few hours, okay, in short-term memory. And then at the end of the day, when we're sleeping, our mind hopefully gets a chance to process out and kind of expel out, urinate out, in a sense, the negative emotions and the negative thoughts. Okay? So in that sense, sleeping and especially dreaming is an important function for us. For those of you who know that if somebody does not get enough sleep, it actually can be toxic. Just the same as if you stop urinating, the toxins will build up in our body. It will build up to a point where it will be dangerous and people can die. Same thing with sleep. If you're sleep deprived, a lot of and sleep deprived is an aspect mainly of our brain. Our body will be sleep deprived, but our body can survive for much longer without rest, though it will continue to get tired. But our brain cannot survive too long without sleep and rest. Typically, our brain can run about 2 or 3 days at most, after which we start to see a lot of serious complications and symptoms arise. And somebody who's been sleep deprived more than a week will have a lot of serious complications, and eventually they will die. So just lack of sleep is something that could kill us. And again, it's because of mental hygiene, because our mind has to process and clear out a lot of these things that are happening. And it's very important for us to do during sleep. So lastly, I want to focus on this idea that if we're not able to sleep, or if we're not able to push out negative thoughts, okay, what can happen? And there's another parallel to this, is that during our waking moments, okay, I mentioned this earlier, during our waking moments, when we have a negative thought, most of us, what we do is we push it back into our subconscious. We kind of push it out of our conscious mind because we don't want to deal with it. It may be a thought that we're afraid of. It may be something we're uncomfortable with, something we're procrastinating with, right? And we push it out. But it stays in our mind. Okay? So think of the parallel physiological function. If we get a sensation to urinate, and the response is not to urinate, but to kind of suppress that sensation, right? That's in effect what we're doing with our mind, right? You can see what will happen is that your bladder will get more and more full, it'll get distended, and after a while, it will leak, right? You will not be able to hold it in. If you keep trying to hold in the impulse to urinate, you cannot do it for so long. But the same thing happens with our mind. If we keep pushing these thoughts away and we kind of ignore them, after a while, they will start to come out. We cannot hold it back. It's leaking. And that's basically what mind wandering is. Mind wandering is when you have thoughts in your mind that it wants to come out, it wants to be processed and maybe dispelled out, but you're not letting your mind do it, okay, because you keep pushing it back in. That's the reason why mind wandering is happening. So if you understand this, okay, then you'll understand why it's so important not to push away those thoughts. And meditation, the type of meditation that I described here, is a process where if that thought comes in, you let it appear, okay? You acknowledge that it's there, and you let it do what it wants. If it wants to stay in your conscious for a few minutes, and this is where your mind is wandering, you're not aware of it, you're allowing it to stay. As soon as you become aware of it, you're not judgmental, and you let that thought extinguish itself. That extinguishing aspect is what we do when we urinate. Okay? So in a sense, you're letting your mind throw out these negative thoughts while we're meditating. So meditation is a lot like sleep. It's not the same thing, but they have correlates that are very similar to sleeping. It's a healthy attitude, but it's a wakeful version of sleeping, you can say. That's a simple way to explain it.
Sanjay, that was excellent. I think that was a very good example, because I think what happens is that people don't realize we are biological creatures. And this process of kind of accumulating toxins and having to get rid of them, even the way in which brain works, forming connections, most of which are actually not going to be useful. So only some of them are going to be useful. So to actually lose some of the connections that you've formed is critical to keep the brain going. So it's like, it's not just like one unidirectional movement, but it is a lot. It's a very broad movement, most of which has to be kind of pared down. So I think this biological example with urination was excellent.
Should we do Q&A? I think that might be
what I want to do is I want to make sure that you can get through everything, because what you're saying is extremely important. I think it's very, very good. So how much more time do you think you want for? Let's plan that, and then we will open the Q&A. How much more time to present everything else that you have?
I doubt if I'm going to be able to present everything, because I have a lot, but I'll pare it down. What I'll do is I'll go into some studies. Well, we can do this either before or after the next breakout, but there are a few studies that I'll talk about, and then we can do Q&A.
Okay, let's do that.
So I'm basically 2/3 through. Maybe 1/3 I have left. So should we? What?
Okay, so you're saying do a quick Q&A, and then you'll finish the rest, and then we will go to breakout rooms, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, folks. So so it's time for questions, but keep the questions only on the topics that we've been talking about. All right. So in order to ask questions, you can raise your hand in Zoom, or you can type !" in chat. What do you think about this dream? What do you think about this analogy? Anybody? All right, I don't see any hands. So let's continue.
Okay. All right.
Okay,
so...
Lynn has a question. Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, could you give an example of when you have a thought that just comes out and you let it go? Because it's hard for me to imagine it.
So this is very personal. It depends on each person, right? So what will happen is as you're meditating quietly, right? And you're just experiencing, you might be hearing the sounds around you. So let's say we're meditating right now in front of our Zoom cameras, and our eyes. If we keep our eyes open, then we're seeing maybe some faces in front of us. We're hearing the audio that's coming into us, and we're just experiencing that. We're not thinking about it. But after a while, somebody might say something. It might be something that I say that might remind you of something, right? Or it might raise a question in you, right? So that's an example where, a thought came into you, right? That's an example where something happened that wasn't part of the meditation. It just happened out of your own mind. So I'm not sure if that answers it.
Okay. Let's do one thing. We're going to give priority to people who have not asked the questions before. So let's start with Daniel. Daniel, go ahead. Daniel, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I keep forgetting. I asked in the chat comments, what techniques do you recommend for letting go of repetitive, intrusive thoughts?
I think the best way to do that is to let them come. But before, let me explain that intrusive thoughts can mean many, many things, right? And the level of intrusion and the type of thought we have to be aware of. You know yourself, we each know ourselves. So we have to be aware of, when we talk about intrusive thoughts, we have to be aware of what types of thoughts they are. If they're extremely, extremely painful thoughts of traumatic events or very painful situations, then you have to be gentle with yourself. You may not want, then you maybe need to be a little cautious, because let me explain this way. What mindfulness meditation is based on, one of the principles it's based on is, again, this is a physiological example, because it is very much similar to that. Our immune system gets trained by exposure, by repetitive exposure, right? And anyone who knows about phobias, right, mental phobias, fears, severe fears of things, those are also addressed by repetitive but gentle exposure. So what we're doing when we're letting these intrusive thoughts come into our mind is we're allowing our mind to be exposed to these sometimes painful, but usually they're disruptive thoughts. You're letting yourself be exposed to it, and you're teaching yourself, or you're training yourself in a way. A part of your mind is learning how to ignore it, how to not react to it, right? So the more you let that happen, and the more longer term, you let that happen, the better your mind will get at it. In the gist, that's what mindfulness meditation, that's what most meditation is about, is you're training your mind through practice by doing something repetitively. It usually takes several weeks, but to get good at it, it'll be a few months. And to become really good at it, takes a few years. So you have to spend a lot of time exposing your mind to the things that you don't want, these intrusive thoughts. But at the same time, if these thoughts are really painful and troubling for you, you have to be cautious, because there's a reason why your mind is pushing back. It's like, you don't want to be pierced with a very sharp needle, right? Because it'll hurt you. And some intrusive thoughts can be like a very sharp needle. They can't hurt us if we allow them to. So you have to know yourself in a way.
Next up is Stephen Hemrick, followed by Steve Sharper. Stephen, go ahead.
Hi. I think the analogy was hilarious, but very apropos. But I think I'm hearing a lot of comments from people regarding thoughts that might come into their head and how they're supposed to react, and that, it's very difficult to meditate, and nobody's perfect. And I think people have to just not rip themselves apart if they can't do it. It's just, and like Sanjay is saying, that the more that you practice, the easier it may become. And we're all striving for this, but not many people achieve it. It's sort of like the Buddha achieving enlightenment. Not many humans are going to do that as well. So,
okay, thank you. Next up is Steve. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, so the phenomenon whereby going to sleep kind of rids your mind of the negative emotion, I wonder, is that a reason why we tend to romanticize the past? So, like, to be clear, there were very difficult times in my life that I look back on, and I only kind of know that they were difficult. Matter of fact, that the negative emotion does not come along with the kind of factual memories, if that makes any sense. But I tend to romanticize even very difficult times in my life. Is that because of this phenomenon that occurs when we go to sleep?
So this happens actually not just when we're asleep. This actually happens also when we're awake. And this is an aspect of our subconscious, that our subconscious is doing similar things when we're awake also. But when we're awake, there's so many other things, especially our conscious is there. So our conscious kind of is what we think we are, and we don't realize what's happening in our subconscious, but similar things are happening in our subconscious. It's not only during sleep. And when you talk about both positive thoughts, romantic thoughts that you might characterize them as, memories, wonderful memories, our mind is processing anything and everything that it wants to, that it feels has emotional weight or emotional energy around it. Energy is something I talked about in the last talk. I haven't talked about it much this time, but it applies completely to this also, because most of our thoughts and emotions are around, they're driven by mental energy. Either you can think of it as in terms of the actual energy that's encoded in the nerves, because everything that happens in our mind is mediated through bioelectrical energy. So energy, and that energy we can think of as having emotional strength. You know, when we talk about emotional strength of energy, it's the personal force that it has on us. So if it's a positive emotional energy or negative, it doesn't really matter. And if you're, most of the time, if you're having positive thoughts come out, I mean, that's a good thing, but they may be coming out because simultaneously you may be having negative thoughts come out, and the positive thoughts are an aspect of the protective mechanism in your mind that's kind of using it to hide the negative thought. So it may be that there's a negative thought hidden in near that positive thought. It's not necessarily related, but you may have simultaneously a negative and positive thought coming out. And the positive thought emerges to protect you from that negative. It's hard to say exactly what's happening because everyone's different, but that's a possibility.
Thanks, Sanjay. Next up is Joe. Joe,
okay, yeah, sorry about that. Kind of got caught a little bit off. And one of our breakout rooms was the idea that we were talking about using other means of ways like psychedelics actually as a way of suppressing thoughts and improving meditation. And then meditation actually can be a way of essentially maintaining your balance of not like bringing up past traumas. I was wondering if you had read any research along those lines or know anything between the combination of certain treatments with psychedelics and mindfulness.
Yeah, I did not look at specifically any hallucinogenics related to meditation. I'm sure there have been some studies done. I did run across some, but I didn't read them. But from my understanding of what hallucinogenics are doing in our brain, they're basically they're enhancing the ability for signal flow. They are making it easier for your brain to have signals go from place to place. And so, to give an example of this is the reason why, you might, and this is most prominent in the more the stronger hallucinogenics, LSD, being one of those. People give the experience that they can hear flavors, they can feel sights, right? I mean, it's so basically what's happening is that when they see something, it goes into their visual cortex, it gets processed, and it leaks out into many areas, because what these hallucinogenics are doing are they're allowing signal transduction to happen more easily, to leak out in effect to many parts of your brain. So they leak out into your auditory system. Okay? So when you see something, when you see an object with your eyes, the experience of that leaks into your ears, in a sense. It leaks into the part of your brain that's processing sound. And so you have an experience of hearing what you're seeing. And you might have an experience of tasting what you're feeling, and all kinds of things. So in the sense of whether it'll enhance meditation, I don't know. It'll be confusing, and it'll cause a lot of, it may enhance, but I don't want to say necessarily, because there could be some downsides to it also. I mean, some people have had bad trips, right? That's something we've heard about. So I wouldn't propose, people experimenting on their own. If you want to talk to your doctor about it, and if it's possible that it can help some people, but it's hard to know if it'll help you specifically.
Okay. Yeah. Last question by Ed. Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just in relation to that. Timothy Leary was doing a lot of studies in the late 60s and then the 70s.
Ed, do keep it short, okay? We are running out of time.
And you were referring to the enhanced experiences. And I've talked to people that have taken LSD, and the enhanced experiences, the enhanced senses are just amazing from what they say. They say they can literally touch the face of God. And what research is being done now as far as that's concerned?
I mean, there have been research done on the concept of sensations of God and spirituality. I mean, I haven't focused on that. I haven't really, I mean, I've read them in the past. You know, there are, at some point a few years ago, there were specific regions and temporal lobes that were thought to be the God region. And there was some research, some companies that had created products, helmets that you can wear that would excite those regions and give people sensation of being very close to God or seeing God. These are things that are real, but I suspect they're probably a part of our neurology or our neurobiology. But also they're very spiritual, and it's very hard to say, you know, what's happening. I don't think that it's something that we can cause to happen in any person, but people who are who have who want to have feelings like that, I think it's easier for them to have, especially when they're having hallucinogenic experiences.
Thanks, Sanjay. Sanjay, I want to say one thing, you know, before we continue, that you have a very unusual approach to this, you know, neuroscience. I see that you have like three things going. One is that you have a very deep appreciation of biology, and which is critical to really approach neuroscience. You can't really understand neuroscience without having a sense of biology at a very deep level. So that's one thing you have. Second is that you're able to access all the research and kind of filter through it, look at, because there is just so much stuff out there, you're able to kind of filter through it and say, this is worth looking at. That's the second thing. And third thing, which actually kind of enables you to do more, is that you actually have kind of observations about your own mind, and everything that you're saying, you're able to kind of bring it to what does it mean in actual experience. So I think that's what it makes it really, really powerful. So I want to make sure that we finish your presentation now, and then we will go back to questions. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I'll wrap it up pretty quickly. I mean, because I do want to get to more questions and maybe another breakout room. So one of the things, I mean, just on what you said, I mean, one of the things that I haven't gone into much, but I know that it's helped me a lot in understanding neurosciences, but actually a lot of behavior, is that I also work in areas of some areas of artificial intelligence, and that's an area that actually fascinates me more, because we're starting to see things there that both corroborate what we see in the human brain, but also it helps us predict things in the human brain. It's a very powerful way to look at things. I find that really exciting for me, and I have not got into that in these discussions because it's harder to explain, you know, so many of these areas. So let's continue. So one of the things I wanted to do just before we wrap up is I wanted to go into some studies. I don't know if I'm going to be able to go into all of these, but there's what I want to talk about is what are some of the limits of meditation, and you know, so I have let me go up. I have two slides on this. Try to get this. Okay, so let me put up the sharing the screen. So the first thing that I think I want to go into is pain, because in various of our talks in the group, I've heard many people ask about pain and whether meditation can really alleviate pain, and what are the powers and abilities. And I looked into this just for this talk because this is an important aspect. And you know, even people like Mamta and some people today asked about the question of when they're sitting in a pose and they have difficulty, you know, what can you do about it? So basically, I'm going to have two slides here, but I'm going to talk through these. So what I did is now there are many types of what are known as meta studies, meta reviews that happens in research all the time, and this is where a group of researchers, or it might be one or two, you know, what they're doing is they're doing a survey of the entire field. And they're looking at other research that have been completed and accepted. And they're reviewing those, they're assessing those, they're trying to find patterns among them, and they're trying to summarize the findings from all of those studies. Okay. So I pulled one of the studies that was done on mindfulness specifically, and specifically this has to do with pain. Okay. And what this study did is it looked at 744 different papers from, I think it was from the year 2002. Oh, sorry about that. It looked at 744 papers from around 2002 up to 2016 when this paper was published. And out of the 744 papers, they found most of them, they found about half of them, around 400 of them, did not cover the specific areas that they wanted to do. I mean, they covered either a part of mindfulness or part of pain, pain alleviation, but they weren't looking at the combination of those. So those roughly 400 papers were not reviewed. The remaining ones, they found many of them were either poor quality studies or they were not done in a blinded way. They were not done appropriately enough, the way science should be done. So they basically came up with 38 studies. And out of the 38 studies, this slide shows 30 of those studies. It summarizes what they found. And all 30 of those studies dealt with mindfulness meditation for chronic pain. So the title here, Mindfulness Meditation for Chronic Pain, a systematic review and meta-analysis. And this is Hilton, Lara Hilton. She and a group did this study in 2016. So in this graph, what you'll see is that there are primarily three groups horizontally. The top group has 4 studies. The middle group has, I think it was 20 studies, and the bottom had, or the middle group has 16, and the bottom had 10 studies. So the top deals with what's known as MBCT, so mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So this is an aspect of cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's using mindfulness techniques with it. And these 4 studies. The middle group looked at mindfulness-based stress reduction. This is the study, the practice that we looked at in this group with Kabat-Zinn, John Kabat-Zinn. He had created this work. And there's 16 studies here. And the bottom group are other studies that don't fall into either of the two, but they're more broad, non-specific type studies. And the finding what you'll see here, and this is specific to the ability of mindfulness meditation to alleviate chronic pain. Chronic pain is pain that is persistent, and it's very debilitating to people, right? And in the middle, the vertical line across the top, if you'll see a dashed vertical line, that vertical line is describing the result of no effect, okay? And the bottommost part of this graph, of this chart, you'll see there's a kind of a graph. It goes from -2 to +5, right? And the middle is 0. And 0 corresponds to no effect. Okay, so if the study found that meditation had no effect on pain, then that study's graph line will be close to 0. And if it had a effect more closer to the -2, that means that it favored control, which means that it favored mindfulness not being effective at all. And if it's more toward the right, it means that mindfulness did have an effect on pain, that mindfulness helped alleviate pain. So if you look across all these 30 studies, around 4 or 5 of them had an effect on pain, okay? And the rest of them showed no effect. Now, that doesn't mean that there was no effect. It simply means that they were unable to show that. It could mean that the studies were not designed in a way to pick it up, or there may be various other reasons why it didn't pick it up. It does not mean that pain cannot be alleviated, but in general, if we look at the overall picture, it's kind of hinting that chronic pain, serious pain, is not something that can be alleviated through meditation. Although four of these studies did show this, and one of these studies, which is by Barth in 2015, it showed a pretty strong correlate around 2.5 median, which is mean, which is fairly strong on this scale. It's almost half up to the maximum that they targeted here. And 2 other studies were above 1, close to 2. So, some of the studies show that there was effect on pain from meditation. Now, one of the challenges that I want to go into is that, and this is, I want to give a little bit of caution because research, there are so many types of research being done. And as I explained, that out of the 744 papers that these authors reviewed, many of them didn't apply, And then additional ones, several hundred, close to 200, were not good studies. And this is actually the situation that oftentimes when you're going online and looking for work or looking for a study, you don't know if that study is good or not. Most people are not able to differentiate that. And just by looking at the study, and it may read very well, it may present itself as very scientific, but if there are structural limits in how it was organized, or let's say that the way they chose the participants, that they allowed the participants to choose themselves and participate voluntarily, that would not be a good study, because you don't want to have people who are interested in mindfulness, or maybe people who've already practiced mindfulness and they feel like it's helped them. If you allow them to participate, then they've already gotten the benefit. So naturally, your study is going to skew toward the positive, right? Whereas what your study should be doing is looking at it as if a person who has no experience with mindfulness, how will that help them, right? Because the reality is that if you want to compare this to a drug, right, to a pharmaceutical agent that's alleviating pain, to an opioid, you want to compare it in the same way that if that person has not taken that drug, right, and they're given that drug for the first time, how will it help them? The same way you want to assess meditation. If they experience it for the first time, what will the effect be? So in that sense, self-selection is and many other aspects of study design are problematic. So what I want to highlight here is that pain alleviation is not has not been shown very strongly, though I do have another study that I want to go into, and this is a more recent study. It's 2017 study, which came after this meta study. And this study shows that pain can be alleviated. Now, what I'm doing is I'm only showing one graph out of the study. It's a long study, and this one graph kind of summarizes a lot of what they found. But I use this study because it actually shows the complexity of what's happening. And one of the things that I want people to understand is that in the neurosciences, especially when we're looking at meditation, there are a lot of questions around what is it that's happening in the mind of a meditator, right? Some of you may understand this thing called a placebo effect, right? And many researchers think that all of the effects from mindfulness are arising out of the placebo effect. Some researchers think it's not, and other researchers think that it may be a combination. And the placebo effect itself is fairly complex. And when you're looking at studies like this, it's very hard to pull out exactly what's happening. And remember, we can't really delve into a person's mind, either during meditation or afterwards, and especially not before, because they're not part of the study beforehand. So, and the data that we get either through EEG study recordings or MRI or PET, any kind of imaging studies, they're gross data. They're not very precise. They do averaging over time, or they do averaging over brain regions, over space, the areas of the brain. So they're all averaging in some way or another. Our instruments today are not that precise. This is a problem we have, but they are getting better. So, and that's one of the reasons why research in this area is so difficult. Not only that it's very difficult to get funding, because these studies require oftentimes minimum weeks, usually months, of at least 30 people. Usually you want to have 100 people or more, and you're bringing them in MRI studies. Running an MRI scan on the same person over and over and over for a few months is quite expensive. So you can imagine that it's very, very difficult to do studies like this, and oftentimes the funding goes to studies that people believe are more worthwhile. A lot of people think that this area is not worthwhile, or it's not high enough on the research food chain, so to speak. So it's quite difficult. So this study I chose because it gets into a lot of the aspects I talked about. It gets into whether pain can be alleviated through mindfulness. It gets into a little bit of the placebo effect. And it designed the controls in specific ways. And I also, hopefully people will start to understand the complexity of doing a good study, although I'm not going to go too much into it. So the graph, basically there are two graphs here, okay? The left-hand graph looks at pain intensity, okay? And pain intensity meaning and so for those of you who might not know, that the way we measure pain in the medical community is that we ask the person. It's a voluntary, usually a 10-point scale, and you ask the person, what's your level of pain from 0 to 10? And the person will say, okay, right now I feel around a 6, or yesterday I felt around a 3, right? The other part of that is that if one person says they're feeling a pain of 6 and a different person says they're feeling a pain of 6, there's no way to know if they're the same level of pain. They probably are not, because pain intensity or pain sensation also has to do with our ability to withstand pain, our ability to be comfortable with pain. It's a very complex area. So this is why it's a purely subjective scale. There's no objective way we have today no reliable objective way, validated way we have of measuring pain yet. So the left graph is measuring volitional pain that people are self-reporting. And the right-hand graph is talking about the unpleasant feeling. And this is, again, it's also subjective, but this is the not only pain, but it's the unpleasant feeling overall of what happened during the meditation. So each of the two graphs look at 4 different areas. Okay? They look at, and I'll describe these, the 4 different plots, the columns, right? So the leftmost column is red, and that is what's known as a control. And what they did in these studies is they took, in this study, they took 75 people, and they started with more than 75, but they drilled it down to 75 based on exclusion and inclusion criteria. And of those 75, they split them into 4 groups. These 4 columns are not the 4 groups. The 4 groups went through, the 4 columns are the 4 groups, but the 4 groups went through 4 cycles of the same meditation practice 4 times. And each column is average of the 4 cycles that, the roughly 15, 20 people went in each group. So the leftmost column is the control group, and that group was given no training in meditation, and they were not typically, if they had any experience, it would have been their own, but they were not guided in any way. And also they were given saline. So all 4 of the groups had a intravenous injection into their arm, which seemed to be some kind of medication. They thought they were getting some medication, and they were asked whether you want to participate. They were told whether the medication was what it was supposed to do. So it was voluntary, and they were told, whether it would be helpful or not, what kind of activity it was. They were given assurances that it was not going to harm them. It was not a drug. It was not a narcotic. That was not used in the study. So the leftmost column, they were given a control fluid, which was basically saline, which is basically, you can think of it as safe water. It's a salt-based water, which our body prefers. So they were basically given this fake IV injection, and they were not given any training, and they were asked to meditate. The next column, which is the dark blue, they were given training in meditation, and they were also given saline. Okay, so they were not given any medication. The third group, which is the light blue, they were given training in meditation, and sorry about that. They were given training medication, and they were given naloxone, which is Narcan is the trade name for it, which is it's not a narcotic, but what it does is it's an antagonist. What it does is, if there is any opioid in your system, it will inactivate it. Okay? And there's a very specific reason why the researchers use this. And I'll go into that in just a minute. And the last column, the orangish column, is where they were not given any training in meditation. They were given an audio recording to listen to instead of meditating. And they were given the naloxone injection during this. So what this study did is it actually looked at whether pain, the sensation of pain, both the intensity and the uncomfortableness, whether it went up or down in the different groups, in the different cohorts. And what they found is that in the control group, their pain level increased. In both the pain intensity and the uncomfortableness increased. And the same thing for the control group that had the naloxone. So the 2 reds, the red and oranges, their pain levels more or less increased. And the 2 in the middle, the blues, their pain levels decreased. And what's striking is that, and both of these 2 groups were the ones who were doing the meditation. And this was specifically mindfulness meditation, the type that I described earlier today. And what's interesting here, the reason why they did this, they designed the study this way, is that they wanted to look specifically at placebo effect, because one of the things that happened in placebo is we wanted to know whether if a person, so I'm hoping that people know placebo. If they don't, I'll give a very brief description of it. Placebo is kind of a psychosomatic behavior where you think, the way you think about something helps your body do it. So it's kind of like if you think that you're going to get over a cold and you're really, really convinced about it, chances are that your body will do things on its own to help you to speed up and recover from a cold a little bit sooner than if you had not. So if it normally takes you 4 days to recover from a cold, if you have a psychosomatic effect, if you have a placebo effect, you might recover in 3.5 days or even 3 days. And that's where, the concept of mind over matter, where your mind is kind of pushing your body to do things. That's what the placebo effect is about. And they wanted to look at that here. And the placebo effect can actually occur in many different ways, but they looked at one specific area here, because what our body does, what our brain can do actually, is it can release neurotransmitters and endorphins and various neurochemicals, which have a pain modulating effect. They actually have a pain alleviating effect. So, for example, some of you who you may be aware that if you cut yourself a slight cut on your finger, you get a paper cut, but you haven't seen it, you won't feel the pain, right? But after you start looking at it and you realize, oh, you cut yourself, then all of a sudden that pain comes in quickly and you start sensing it, right? That's an example of this, where if your mind is not aware of actual trauma or damage, then your mind usually is able to block that pain sensation. And only if you become aware that you've been injured, then your mind stops blocking, then you because you know that you have to deal with it, you have to put a Band-Aid on, right? So you don't want to block the pain sensation. So what this was doing is it was looking at the possibility that if people are meditating, that their mind is releasing these types of neurochemicals that are acting as painkillers, right? So they use this naloxone, which blocks opioid type of molecules. And so what this study found is that whether they received or did not receive naloxone, it didn't make a difference. Their sensation of pain reduced through meditation, right? And what that basically says, what the finding was that meditate in this group of people, and you have to remember that they were taught in a very specific type of meditation practice, and they received training in it. That's what's important. A lot of the studies that are done, they might receive different types of meditation training, or they might receive a broad range of meditation training, which makes it much harder to study. So this one, what they found is that the type of meditation that these people were taught, it did not seem to be based on the placebo effect, or at least one aspect of placebo effect. Their mind was not causing their body to release opioid-like molecules to alleviate the pain. It was actually something that was happening based on the meditation. So that's an important element, though this is one study. And the authors of this study, even though they found that there was a positive correlation with mindfulness, their conclusion still was that this study did not find it with sufficient statistical power. Okay? Their conclusion was that it was not a strong enough finding to say that this will work in everybody. They realized that their study was done in a certain way that it gave impression that it probably is helping, but and this is what research all the time they do, is that they will suggest follow-up activity. They suggested that further studies evaluate this. So there have been a lot of studies in this area. The first slide that I showed 30 of them, but the majority of those, again, showed very little effect. So this is one area of mindfulness. Let me stop now. It's almost quarter after 11. So if we can.
Okay, let's open it. It is good that you went through this, because people have tendency of just jumping into a study and concluding something from it. And you just have to look at multiple studies and see exactly what the people did. So thank you. So folks, this is your last chance to ask questions to Sanjay. You can go ahead and type !! in Zoom to ask questions. Joe is first. Joe, go ahead.
Really quickly, are they doing anything to discover whether they can map people's perception of their pain and fMRIs, so that they have the images of the brain where they can then start to have a independent scan that says, you know, okay, we have an idea of what people are reporting and what images are showing. I still don't think, you know, it really is going to capture what another person's experiencing personally, but I was just wondering if there was anything that was being done in that particular area.
Yeah, very good question. So pain actually has two components. It has obviously the physiological component, right, which is the electrical signals and the neurochemical signals that travel through nerves go into your brainstem, and then they propagate through into other parts of our brain. So the one part is the physiological aspect of it, which is very, very important. And measuring that is possible. That we have many instruments that can measure that. Though, you know, when people experience chronic pain, they arise from inside their body. So it's very difficult unless you operate on them and put these instruments in. It's very difficult to do those types of studies. The second part of pain is the psychological aspect. And that's very, very subjective. And the difficulty here is that what happens in our brain isn't, especially when someone is having chronic pain, it's oftentimes they have many, many other things happening in their mind also. That chronic pain builds up anxiety, and it may cause stress in them. It may bring up memories and other thoughts, and it may, their brain gets flooded with all kinds of thoughts and emotions simultaneously when they're having extreme pain. So, for example, someone who's having a migraine headache, that's a type of chronic pain. If you experience migraine headaches, you have difficulty concentrating. You can have, if you have intrusive thoughts also, those intrusive thoughts will become more powerful. It becomes much harder to push your mind into doing what you want to do. It's almost like you get into a zone. Your mind really goes into a tunnel vision type of situation where you can't get out of the sensation of pain. And again, the physical and psychological feeling of pain. And because of this is what happens. The studies that were done, I mean, I have not been looking at this because there are few that are done well, because it is very difficult to do. There's actually one study I read a few years ago, and I don't remember the details of it, but this was the only study that I'm aware of. There probably are others since then. But this is the only study that I'm aware of now, which actually tried to characterize, it tried to assess a validated method for measuring pain on a quantitative scale. I don't remember exactly the method they used, but it was based on, they used neuroimaging and they used several other instrumentation. I don't remember the details. I'm sorry about that, but it was not fully conclusive at that time. That's one of the problems, because this is a very difficult thing to do. Measuring pain it goes across many, many areas of our behavior, and that's only if we're talking about physical pain. Once we get into phantom pain and psychological pain and subjective pain, or pain from emotional pain, purely emotional pain, that adds to the difficulty of this.
Thank you, Sanjay. Vanessa, what's your question?
Okay, well, while it may not alleviate the pain, is it possible by doing the meditation, you can maybe find what the root of the pain or the trigger that brings it on, so at least you can make that connection to either not do that activity or alleviate?
Yeah. So thanks for that. I mean, there's so much in my mind that I know I'm going to forget things. So when you asked that question, it reminded me, because the second study that I posted, it actually went into this, and these studies try to evaluate a lot of what's happening in our brain, and it's very difficult to do. So what they suspect is that in the people who had reduced pain sensation, it was not due to any release of, let's say, opioids or opioid-like neuromolecule, biological molecules that our body secretes from time to time, but it was more than likely that the way that they processed the feeling of, not feeling as in the physiological feeling, but the emotional awareness of pain, that these people were processing the emotional what was happening in various parts of mind. I mean, the study actually went, I left out a lot because they actually use a lot of brain imaging, and there are other slides that I have, which will be much more difficult to explain, but that's why I didn't go into those. But they actually found brain regions which seem to be more enhanced, and other regions which were less enhanced, and whether it's enhanced higher or lower doesn't really make a difference. It's basically you're not looking at the direction of enhancement, you're looking at the magnitude. And so they found that these people were more than likely, the way that they processed pain, the way that they thought about their pain, the way that they accepted their pain, that's what was different. And they also looked at because the groups were not selected specifically, they had people who had not done meditation at all, who were very new to it. And they also looked at people who had some experience meditating. And then when they looked across those groups, when they split them across those, they found that the people who were new to meditation, a specific region of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, was that, and there was another group, another area, which had heightened activation. And what that seemed to be implying was that, and this is getting into, I forget who asked the question earlier, but around executive function. What this was showing was that the people who didn't have experience meditating, they were resorting to their executive function more because that's a part of our brain. When something happens that we're not familiar with, when we don't understand what's happening, our executive function kicks in to try to make sense of it. This is what they suspect was happening in those new adopters of meditation. So it's very interesting. I mean, there's a lot more I can go into, but it's difficult to explain a lot of that. So I'm trying to keep it simple here.
Excellent. Next up is Gretchen. Gretchen, go ahead.
Yes. I actually typed my question here. Let me go take a look at it here. So along the same lines, about, neurological scans, etc. As far as those go, are there studies or are there going on that enable the identification of anxiety and depression and where they're located in the brain for use in identifying perhaps the most probably antidepressants or anti-anxiety meds, things like that? That would be most effective in that particular brain scan result.
So So first, let me say that the way anxiety or depression occurs in different people, it can occur in different ways. I mean, there are brain regions that are common to people who have these conditions, but there are also enough variation that it's very difficult to simply rely on just the brain scans, and also the way that scan, using MRI, for example, fMRI, the way that these measurements are taken, that they're time averaged, and then the time average of each patient is time averaged across a cohort in the study, and then you may have multiple cohorts. So it's actually the statistics of it and how the averaging is done is very difficult to be able to say that we have definitive answers on how it affects people across the board. It might be possible to say for a specific person whether it helps them, but this is not a modality that's cheap. Going to a psychiatrist or psychologist, costs money, but going to a psychologist, psychiatrist, and going through fMRI studies is much, much more expensive, and most people, it's not practical to do that. So, the studies that have looked at this across the board, across groups, have not found a lot. They have found benefit, and again, the challenge here is that the various studies use different types of meditation practices. They select the patients in different ways. The experience level of the patients or what condition they're dealing with are different. So because there's so much variability in the inputs, the starting condition that the studies go from, there's so much variability there that it becomes very difficult to come up with conclusions that can be drawn across the board for everybody who has depression or everybody who has anxiety. The studies need to get more focused, and they have to become much more disciplined in how they are designed. But at the same time, if you do that, that means your study will not be as large, or it may be more, it may take more time to recruit enough people for your study. So it becomes very, very difficult to do. It's very difficult. I mean, some studies have shown there are benefits, okay? But whether it'll benefit any person, like on average, any person, that's difficult to say. That depends on the condition.
Excellent. So we're running a little late, so let's go ahead and do the takeaways.